It was a quiet Thursday night at the Wingate Inn, a modest hotel just north of Atlanta. The air outside was still, carrying a calmness that mirrored the uneventful rhythm of the day. Inside, the hotel radiated a sense of peaceful routine. The faint hum of fluorescent lights echoed through the lobby, while the aroma of freshly brewed coffee lingered, a comforting reminder of home for weary travelers. It was the festive season, and with Christmas only 3 weeks away, it would have seemed that the joy of holidays was practically just around every corner. In this back office, the manager of the hotel, Rodney, sat engrossed with his work. Rodney was focused and dedicated, a man of precision, taking hours for the proper running of the hotel. He was deeply engrossed, scanning spreadsheets and double-checking invoices, his pen tapping lightly against the desk in muted cadence. Out front, Carlos Torres, the affable night clerk, stood ready to help. He glanced occasionally toward the entrance, expecting the rare overnight guest or late-night visitor. The night was still, and everything about it felt routine, until it didn't. At about 10 p.m., the silence was shattered. The hotel's glass doors burst open with force, and 2 men entered, their movements sharp and purposeful. They were there in an instant, jarringly so from the serene atmosphere of just a moment before. One of them, with a gun in his hand, jumped over the reception counter. Another one stood near the door and watched. The voice of the gunman, now loud and menacing, reverberated, "Give me the money!" There was no room for deliberation in his tone. As reality set in, Carlos froze. His body ran with adrenaline. Shaking, he opened the cash drawer and handed over the bills. The hopes that compliance might save him raced through his mind, but the gunman wasn't satisfied. In a sudden burst of anger, he struck Carlos on the side of the head with the butt of the pistol. The impact of the force sent a dazed Carlos stumbling, blood streaming down his face as the gunman demanded to know where the safe was. Rodney in the back office heard the commotion. Alarmed but composed, he set down his work and stepped into the lobby, his presence calm yet firm. Rodney was one of those men who always felt that conflicts were better solved by reason, and there was an authority in the sound of his voice. "There is no safe," he said, his voice even as the scene before him was spiraling out of control. For a moment, it almost seemed as if his words would relax the situation. But the gunman, desperate and on adrenaline, didn't flinch. In an instant, the gunman raised his gun and shot. The sharp crack of the shot resounded through the lobby, freezing time. Rodney went backwards, clutching his chest as life ran out of him. He fell on the floor, shallow in breathing and hugging on to the last breaths. Still shocked with injury, all Carlos could do was watch in horror while his manager friend just collapsed before him. The 2 fled into darkness, leaving them behind with blood, chaos, and a heartbroken scene. Dazed and injured, Carlos went to the hotel's phone and tried calling for assistance, but he was too shaky and had forgotten how to dial out. In desperation, he ran from the hotel and across the street to a nearby bowling alley in search of help. Bursting through the doors, his voice was frantic as he begged the patrons to call 911. In a moment, strangers were taking immediate action, and within minutes, paramedics were being dispatched to the scene. When the paramedics arrived at the Wingate Inn, Rodney was unresponsive. He was in critical condition, and every second counted as they rushed him to Kennestone Hospital. The damage was too much to repair. Rodney Caslin was pronounced dead upon arrival. That night, the quiet evening was disrupted by a knock at the door at the Caslin home. Kelly Caslin, Rodney's wife, answered the door to find Detective John Dawes standing on her porch, his face somber with the weight of the news he carried in his posture. Gently, but with visible sorrow, he informed Kelly that her husband had been killed during a robbery at the hotel. The words seemed surreal, almost impossible to comprehend. Kelly's heart broke as the weight of the tragedy fell upon her. She stood in the doorway, frozen, trying to comprehend what she was being told. Just hours before, she had spoken with Rodney, the routine comfort of their conversation now forever lost. In an instant, her world had changed, and the man she loved, the father of their children, her partner, her rock, was gone. The life they had built together filled her mind as Kelly struggled to wrap her head around this nightmare of an event. Rodney had been a kind and honorable man, the first to lend a helping hand. It wasn't just a personal loss, but also a loss to anyone who had benefited from his warm and generous character. The sadness that wrapped itself around Kelly and her family was deep and would remain so for years to come. Meanwhile, back at the Wingate Inn, investigators were racing against the clock to reconstruct the events of the night. Crime scene technicians crawled through every nook and cranny of the lobby in search of any shred of evidence that might point them in the direction of the perpetrators. The cash drawer was empty, the robbers having escaped with a meager $304, the shockingly small haul considering a life had been taken. They also found one lodged into the wood near the baseboard, serving as a grim reminder of the violence that had exploded. But the most important discovery was a set of fingerprints and a palm print left on the registration counter. The prints were clear enough for analysis, and investigators hoped they would provide a lead. But when they were run through George's automated fingerprint identification system, AFIS, there were no matches. What looked like a promising clue turned out to be just another dead end, and in a hurry the case went cold. Not knowing was agony to Kelly and her family. Days ran into weeks and weeks into months, but the perpetrators were never found. The Castlin family was left to grieve with no closure, while the investigators remained behind the scenes, determined not to give up on the case. The case of Rodney Castlin's murder remained unsolved for years. The Wingate Inn went about business as if nothing had changed, but to the employees working there, it was as though the lobby was haunted by what happened that night in December. Those employees who knew Rodney spoke of him frequently, of how dedicated he was to the job, of how kind to his team, and of how every guest mattered in his eyes. Yet, with the passing of time, the trail to his killers grew cold. The fingerprints left at the scene, once a beacon of hope, yielded no matches in George's database. Investigators had little else to go on. For Rodney's family, each passing year without answers deepened their grief and frustration. But it wasn't until over a decade later that there was finally a break in the case. That came in 2012 when Detective John Dawes received a teletype from Florida that reignited the case. A man in federal custody claimed he had information about a robbery and murder at a hotel with Wynn in its name near Atlanta. He said the crime happened 12 years earlier, and he was the getaway driver. The information provided by the man was chilling. He related how his accomplice, James Lorenzo Randolph, had executed the robbery. Randolph was armed, reckless, and didn't have the slightest hesitation when pulling the trigger. With this news, Detective Dawes felt his first sense of hope. He took those fingerprints again and ran them against the revamped national AFIS database, where now a record accumulation from all over the country existed. The results were returned in record time and confirmed the informant's words. The left little finger found on the counter belonged to James Lorenzo Randolph. With the suspect identified, investigators began researching Randolph's history of crime. What they found was a pattern of violence and lawlessness. Shortly after Rodney's murder, Randolph had been arrested for robbing a sandwich shop in South Carolina. He received almost 10 years in prison and then was let out, only to return to his criminal life. By the time investigators were able to link him to the Wingate Inn case, he was residing in Florida, deep in illegal activities. The snitch, whose identity was kept hidden for his protection, gave crucial information about the night of the crime. He said he had driven Randolph and another accomplice to the hotel. Randolph had come into the lobby waving a gun around and had ordered money from Carlos Torres, after which Rodney, trying to calm things down, had instantly gotten Randolph's unforecasted, blunt, opening rounds. Snitch's testimony was quite vivid and frightening, the one matching to what could have been told from the evidence present on the crime scene itself. Now, Detective Dawes and his team had the pieces to move forward. Randolph was indicted for felony murder, aggravated assault, and armed robbery. It had been a long, laborious road to justice, but finally, it gained momentum. The trial of James Lorenzo Randolph was a highly anticipated event. In the courtroom sat Rodney's family and friends, united by their grief and their hope for justice. There, too, was Kelly Caslin, her presence a silent but potent reminder of the man they'd lost. The prosecution had a very strong case to make, and it began with the forensic evidence that put Randolph at the scene. The fingerprints, which initially were a dead end, became the cornerstone of this investigation. The most damning testimony came from the informant, who took the stand to recount every detail of that fateful night. His words were chilling, describing how Randolph had shown no hesitation in pulling the trigger. Physical evidence combined with testimony pointed out a case undeniably to be that of Randolph's guilt. The jury listened intently, their faces reflecting the weight of the case. The verdict was read in a silent courtroom. Randolph was found guilty on all counts against him. He was sentenced to 3 life terms plus 35 years, a sentence that will ensure he never walks free again. This verdict brought closure for Kelly and her family, though it would never erase the pain of losing Rodney. Long after the trial had been done and over, Rodney's family didn't cease to work in remembrance of his name. Kelly described her husband as the embodiment of kindness, a man who treated every single person with compassion. Rodney believed in helping people, Kelly said, her voice clearly choked with emotion. That is what made him so special. He treated every person like they mattered. The Caslin family took that pain and turned it into action, supporting causes representing Rodney's values. They joined their efforts with local charities in order to support victims of violent crimes. They organized community events to raise awareness and became spokespeople for love and justice. Kelly would often speak publicly of Rodney's story, hoping to inspire the love of leading others with empathy. To those who knew Rodney, his absence was a certain void, yet his star continued to shine. Friends remembered his robust laugh, his commitment to the job always done well, and how he made everyone feel important. Colleagues remembered how he brought calm into chaos and always did the right thing. His family remembered a man who loved deeply and lived on purpose. While the Wingate Inn has moved on, the events of that tragic night remain etched into its history. The lobby of Wingate Inn has always been a place of routine and hospitality, but it turned out to be the site of an unthinkable loss. Yet, for all the pain it represents, Rodney Caslin's story is also one of resilience and hope. It is a testament to the determination of law enforcement, the power of forensic science, and the unbreakable bond of a family determined to preserve his legacy. Rodney's life, though cut short in tragedy, serves to remind us of the great changes one man can bring upon the world. His story continues to inspire others to love their families, be kind to one another, and stand up for what is right. His light lives on through those who loved him, and his memory will be carried on for generations to come. Rodney Caslin's story is a powerful reminder of the values that bind us: kindness, compassion, and resilience. His tragic death should not only be remembered, but serve as a catalyst for change, urging us to create a safer and more caring world. Consider victim advocacy organizations that support the family members after such heinous crimes. The entities support these family members with much-needed counseling to legal representation in court. Make this your own. Volunteer your time or resources at one of the many local community safety initiatives, such as a neighborhood watch group or an organization dealing with mental health as it relates to preventing crimes in your area. These can reinforce communal ties and minimize the possibilities of violence. Educate yourself and others on how to prevent crime. Awareness is a powerful tool in the protection of those around us, be it learning personal safety or understanding and supporting policies that address the roots of crime. Standing up for effective reform may be what's needed to make the justice system one that balances accountability with prevention. Above all, remember to continue living your life in a manner that emulates Rodney's kind spirit and integrity. He was one of those rare individuals who treated everyone with respect, compassion, and care, attributes that linger on. Every little bit of good may be the beginning of great changes that will make someone else copy the example. His family decided to turn their grief into something active, turning the pain into a calling to serve others. By doing so, they remind us that even in the face of unimaginable loss, we have the power to create something meaningful. Let Rodney's story inspire and move you into action in your way to make a difference in your community and keep his memory alive. Together, let's turn tragedy into hope and build a world where stories of young people like Rodney move us toward resilience and transformation. Susan Schwarz was more than just a name. She was the ray of sunshine in other people's lives. A bubbly young lady full of dreams and aspirations, had a heart full of kindness. But that one ordinary day in 1979, that light was so mercilessly dimmed. A home that once echoed with laughter and love now became a chilling crime scene, a place where innocence was shattered and the echoes of gunshots lingered longer than the life that was taken. For years, Susan's name was spoken in hushed conversations. Friends remembered her smile, family mourned in silence, and detectives combed through mountains of evidence that led to nowhere. Her case was like a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces, a story with no ending. But truth has a way of resurfacing, even after decades. This is not a tragedy story, but one of resilience, justice, and the undying hope of those who refuse to let Susan's memory go away. This is Susan Schwarz's story. Susan Schwarz's murder wasn't just another statistic. It sent shockwaves across the tight community of Alderwood, people locking doors at night and neighbors exchanging terrified glances, some families grieving such a tragic loss of life. Her tale turned into that haunted reminder, even in the most harmless places, things can be awfully wrong. With detectives surrounding crime scene photographs, pouring through evidence, it was Susan's face etched inside their minds. It wasn't just about bringing closure to a case. It was about bringing peace to a grieving family and justice to a young woman whose future was so unfairly taken. Her legacy reached well beyond her death to become a catalyst for change and vigilance in the community. Every year at local memorials, her name was spoken, and the town's sense of loss grew heavier. The whispers continued, but so did the relentless pursuit of answers. I had been a Snohomish County deputy sheriff assigned to the detective division when it came in. A morning call, urgent. It was a homicide. It was in the Alderwood area, and they needed someone out there to process the scene for fingerprints. Susan Schwarz was just 24 years old. Life lay at her feet, full of promise, plans, and unwritten chapters. But then, that instant happened. Her boyfriend entered into their small off-highway house to find her lying dead on the floor. I can only imagine the way his heart must have dropped in, the incredulity and confusion giving way to horror as the scene unfolded before him. Her hands were tightly bound behind her back with electrical cords digging into her wrists as if without mercy or hesitation. She was naked, vulnerable in the worst possible way. One wound to the head was all there was, but it told us everything. This wasn't some burglary gone wrong. It was something much darker. something deliberate. A pillow next to her was marked with blood, ripped open by the gunshot wound that had killed her. The stuffing peeked out from the tear, an eerie, silent witness to the violence that had gone down. A black bra wrapped tightly around her face over her mouth served as a gag, a haunting reminder of the final moments she endured. Casings from a .22 caliber gun lay scattered across the floor like discarded remnants of someone's twisted plan. Every detail told the same grim story. This was not a murder. It was an execution. That scene weighed a ton. As detectives, we are trained to compartmentalize to focus on the facts. But standing in that room, it was impossible not to feel the cruelty, the meanness behind what had happened. Susan's story didn't deserve to end this way, and at that moment, one thing was clear. We wouldn't stop until justice was found. Entering that room was a walk into a dream. Frozen, the small house, once filled with laughter and love, became cold and heavy due to death's strong stench. It almost seemed like time itself had simply stopped, leaving behind only the echoes of what had been. Every nook in that room whispered its silent, sad story. What had happened there? Innocence taken by force, swift violence. Every little aspect of the crime scene showed signs of an act that was calculated and deliberate, as if whoever had done this had taken his time, making sure that nothing was left to chance. As we documented every object, every faint trace, the weight of the case settled over us like an invisible shroud. The atmosphere hung heavy, as if the walls themselves mourned her loss. Susan's boyfriend sat on the front steps, quiet and still, head buried in his hands. I remember watching him from the window, his body trembling, shoulders slumped in defeat. The shock was etched deeply into his face. How could a morning that started with the simplicity of breakfast and routine end in something so unspeakable? Her personal belongings had been left alone, the purse on the table and her shoes near the doorway. The TV remote lay on top of the half-read book beside her. These, the mundane residuals of a life gone abruptly, were strong pointers to the fact that this wasn't any robbery, isn't random. It was just plain and simple evil, coming for her in an unguarded moment and whisking her away in dark stealth. Detectives worked methodically, sifting through every fiber, lifting prints from surfaces, knowing even the tiniest detail might unravel the truth. But as days bled into weeks, that glimmer of hope began to fade. Leads went cold, and the calls that once flooded our lines fell silent. Day in and day out, the haunting realization was settling in. Justice for Susan might take years, maybe decades. Why Susan? Why her? It was a question that nagged us all. She wasn't into anything that might have brought harm her way. By all accounts, she was kind, responsible, and full of life. The randomness made it more difficult to fathom the type of case that would be in your head long after punching out at the end of the shift. We weren't just chasing a suspect, we were chasing closure for a life stolen too soon, with the hope that one day the answers would finally come. The investigation got underway immediately. We investigated her personal life, her relationships, her friends. Susan was popular, outgoing, and had a bright future ahead of her. But even the most ordinary lives sometimes cross paths with danger. Her closest friend, Karen Smith, was brought in for questioning. She mentioned an abusive husband, Gregory Johnson. Greg did not like Susan. He believed she was meddling in his marriage. Susan didn't trust him, and she had every reason not to. He had a name. Violent, unpredictable, dangerous. Greg's alibi was hinky fishing, he said. But when we spoke to the people he said were with him, none of them could support his story. Memories fade, but suspicion lingers. Months went by as we hit brick wall after brick wall. Leads dried up, and Susan's case grew colder by the day. Greg Johnson remained very much at the front of our inquiry. He had a short fuse, and many who crossed him had to bear the brunt of his anger. Karen, Susan's best friend, painted a dramatic picture of Greg's controlling nature and escalating abuse. Susan's protective instincts had led her to challenge Greg, making her a target. As detectives interviewed more people from Susan's inner circle, a troubling pattern emerged. Greg's jealousy and paranoia weren't isolated incidents, and the more we uncovered, the more convinced we became that Susan's confrontation with Greg had deadly consequences. Yet, despite overwhelming suspicion, concrete evidence was elusive and frustration mounted with each passing day. But cold cases have a way of heating up when you least expect them to. In 1986, 7 years after Susan's murder, Seattle detectives encountered a case with eerie similarities. Molly McClure was found dead in her home, tied up, gagged, and shot execution style. The suspect, Sherwood Knight. But Sherwood wasn't just any suspect. He was Gregory Johnson's half-brother. The connections were there, but not enough to arrest for Susan's murder. Years went by. Gregory was sent to prison on robbery charges, and Sherwood lived his life. Susan's case went cold until a deck of cards changed everything. The chilling similarities between Molly McClure's case and Susan's murder reignited our determination. Sherwood Knight's involvement brought Greg back into the spotlight, but with limited evidence, there was little we could do. Too glaring to be ignored were the threads that wove the two brothers into two separate homicides. We pulled out old files and searched for overlooked connection statements that could be re-examined. With each piece of evidence, the puzzle grew, yet without a confession or forensic link, justice remained just out of reach. Still, the new development kept hope alive, serving as a reminder that the smallest clue could eventually unravel the truth. Cold case investigators attempted something new in 2009. Faces of unsolved murder victims were printed onto playing cards and distributed to prison inmates. On the Queen of Hearts was Susan Schwarz. 2 years later, Sherwood Knight held that card in his hands. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was fear, but he began to talk. Greg drove up to see him that day, Sherwood said, told him to cover for him. "I killed Sue," Greg admitted, as if it were nothing more than a passing thought. For 32 years, Greg kept his secret. For 32 years, Susan's family waited. But in 2011, Greg finally pled guilty to second-degree murder. But this story doesn't end there. Greg blamed Susan. Even in court, he showed no remorse. He claimed she meddled. But Susan did what any good friend would do. She protected Karen. She stood up for what was right. And for that, she paid the ultimate price. Susan's story is not about the crime. It's about the ripple effect of abuse, the power of friendship, detectives who never stopped searching, a family that never stopped hoping, and strangers who refused to let Susan's name be forgotten. Her case reminds us that justice, however belated, is worth pursuing. And Susan Schwarz, she can finally rest. Susan's family described her as the type of person who would stop whatever she was doing and help any person in need. Her compassion towards others was one of her defining characteristics. In high school, she volunteered at local shelters. She was studying to be a social service professional, hoping to make the world a little better, one person at a time. Her light touched many lives. Though her life was taken, her spirit endures. Since then, friends of Susan have created awareness campaigns in her memory to help victims of domestic abuse and violence. They keep her story alive, not as some sort of cautionary tale, but as a beacon of hope. The cold case murder of Susan underscores the importance of perseverance in criminal investigations. Stories like hers remind one that solutions to cold cases often come from the most unlikely of places, whether through DNA advancements, inmate confessions, or relentless detectives. For true crime enthusiasts, Susan's story offers a compelling example of how justice prevails despite the passing of time. Susan's story is a powerful reminder that even the smallest piece of information can crack a case wide open. If you know something, anything about a cold case in your area, don't stay silent. Your voice could be the key to justice. And if you want to hear more stories that deserve to be told, make sure to subscribe to my channel. Together we can shine a light on the past and help bring peace to families still waiting for answers.